Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here. I remember really clearly going to my first psychedelic conference, which was in Basel, maybe 10 years ago, and I thought, where are all the women speakers? The best speaker I saw that weekend was Kat Harrison. So it's such a privilege to be on a panel with Kat and with all of you wonderful women, so thank you. Towards a radical uncertainty. I was going to subtitle this talk, or How I Stopped Being Afraid of the Dark, but I'm not sure I'm quite there yet. But in the spirit of radical uncertainty, I'm not going to be offering any answers. This is a series of questions that emerged from a concentrated period of ayahuasca use last spring. But broadly, I want to talk about how darkness and uncertainty have been deeply undervalued by our patriarchal culture, which favours that which can be measured and seen. And I want to look at how plant spirit medicines might offer us a much needed bridge back to some reverence for darkness, and also look at how being able to tolerate uncertainty might be an increasingly urgent social and environmental need. So let me start with a confession. I have been very afraid of the dark. As a child, I used to sleep with the lights on. I used to check behind things, underneath things, behind things, because the darkness held, well, I didn't know. And that was the problem. In the dark, our fantasies project their most fearful forms. Even just to say those 4 words, afraid of the dark, it holds such a host of archetypal fears. It's fairy tales, it's nightmares, it's the wood in which we lose our way, it's the night in which our demons find us. And as I grew up, I thought I'd let all that go. I thought I'd given up being afraid of the dark. But when in March of last year, I found myself lying on a mat in the utter darkness, in the middle of the Peruvian jungle, having taken a very, very strong dose of ayahuasca, I realised that I hadn't. Not at all, quite the opposite, in fact. I was absolutely terrified. And this is where I was. It's a place called the Temple of the Way of Light. I realised they are actually supporting this conference. It's not an advert for the temple, but it is an extraordinary place which employs mostly female healers. And I'd gone there, I was struggling with a health issue that I've been battling with for about 5 years. And as I went into my first ceremony, I held my attention really tightly. You know, I was going to gain insight. I was going to find the key that was going to unlock my health. But what actually happened was that I became overwhelmed by terror. And at various points, this terror reached operatic proportions. There was an epic thunderstorm. I became convinced a jaguar had come into the Moloko and was prowling around. It came and sat behind my head, growled at me. I left the Moloko, I went back to my tambo, and I lay there in this abject fear, which didn't cease for days. And as the ceremonies progressed, I began to gain some distance for this fear. I saw a lot of it wasn't even mine. It had been handed down by my parents, by their parents, a sort of twisted intergenerational baton in the relay of life, and it was also from society. You know, I'd imbibed it in the womb and as a child. And as I reached the end of these ceremonies, I was shown myself, by the medicine, I was shown myself sitting underneath these 3 words. I don't know. And essentially, the medicine said to me that I needed to sit underneath those 3 words and meditate underneath those 3 words and learn to tolerate uncertainty. And it said to me, don't come back, don't take any more medicine until you have sat with this. And so I emerged from the Amazon and I tried to integrate some of these experiences, and I began to think about how tolerating uncertainty might be important not just for me, but for society in a wider social and environmental context. Okay, I want to think a little bit about darkness. It's really difficult to find ourselves in darkness nowadays. If we live in a city, as most of us on the planet now do, we've got a 24-hour culture, it's strip-lit, it's light-polluted, the stars have gone out in our skies, and as city dwellers, you know, we're not going to experience darkness unless we actively seek it. I'd even go so far as to say it's become a luxury item. People save thousands of pounds to go to places where there's no electricity and they can experience true darkness. And I looked in the Oxford Thesaurus, that great arbiter of language, when I was writing this piece for the phrase "in the dark," and I found the following definitions: unaware, uninformed, oblivious, ignorant, unenlightened, unacquainted. So we can see that the shunning of the dark is encoded at the very level of language, and if the Oxford Thesaurus says it's so, it has to be so. But not one of these phrases suggests that the darkness might be anything other than an unfruitful and unprofitable place to dwell. And we're culturally conditioned then, both literally and metaphorically, to shun being in the dark. So how easy is it for us to admit that we're in the dark, that we don't know something? I don't know about you, but I, particularly professionally, I find it very difficult to say that I don't know. I think the ego finds it really hard. Instead of admitting we don't know, we hedge, we bluff, we retreat behind our defences, we split. Or we feign certainty. We shout louder in the hopes that nobody's going to see the fear behind our eyes. So why all this need for certainty? Where did it come from? Well, I think, in terms of our professional lives, it's fairly obvious, unless we're very lucky. We're living with a particular brand of vicious capitalism. In admitting we don't know can be seen as a sign of weakness. But I think it goes back a lot further. In scientific terms, it goes back to the Enlightenment, at the very least. The clue's in the name. It literally sought to bring light to the darkness of not knowing. And I think in the process, it gendered that darkness. Wonderful Francis Bacon, the founder of the scientific method, you may well know this quote, declaring that nature should be tortured. She should be put on the rack until she reveals her secrets. And really, I think with the inauguration of the scientific method, we're culturally on a bit of an inexorable linear line of progress, or an idea of progress, out of the dark, away from superstition, towards a point where everything is going to be understood in the clear light of scientific inquiry. For me, I'm really interested in the high summer, I think, of this idea of progress, which is, I think, the late Victorian and Edwardian era. I'm a novelist, and at the moment I'm writing a novel set in 1911. And in 1911, one of the things that was all the rage was eugenics. You may know about eugenics. Broadly, it's the idea that we can breed better humans. There's positive eugenics, which is the best people breed, and there's negative eugenics, which is that the people that shouldn't breed are prevented from breeding. And the founder of the eugenics movement was a chap called Francis Galton, who he is. A late Victorian patriarch, you can tell by the facial hair. And he was Charles Darwin's first cousin. And he was obsessed, he was infatuated by On the Origin of Species, and he wanted to bring Darwin's theories to bear on the human race. He died early in 1911, and in his obituary in the Eugenics Review, it stated that Galton had a great appetite for menstruation. Now, me being me, in the Wellcome collection, and maybe you being you, I read this as menstruation. And I thought, well, it's a great thing for a late Victorian patriarch to be into. Maybe he wasn't so bad after all. But oh no, menstruation is, as you probably all know, the act of measuring. But it struck me, that menstruation and menstruation are opposite poles. One is the preserve of the patriarch. It believes everything can be measured. It carries a slide rule in its pocket at all times. And then the other, which, though it runs by its own clock, it's cyclical. It reaches towards the infinite. It's the home and birthplace of our consciousness. But these guys, these eugenicists, they had an absolute mania for menstruation. You can laugh at their excesses, but their work is hugely influential today. Galton used to gather the vital statistics of thousands of British citizens. He wanted to prove that the higher classes were genetically superior. And in the process, he founded psychometrics. His protege, Carl Pearson, you could find him measuring the skulls of Cambridge undergraduates to show that bigger skulls meant bigger brains. But he's the father of statistical analysis. Hugely, hugely influential today. And Galton was an explorer. He went to Namibia. He mapped its wilderness triumphantly, paving the way for the colonization that was going to follow in its wake. So menstruation is intimately tied to power and to patriarchy. And if it's tied to power, well, who suffers when things are measured? Well, of course, it's those whose subjectivity is decreed to be less important. It's women, it's indigenous people, it's animals, it's plants, it's the land. And in fact, in almost every instance, attempts by a dominator culture to measure and taxonomize, to make certain, leads to exploitation. The Doomsday Book here, William the Conqueror, comes here, he wants to find out what he's got. It kicks off the enclosures movement, which lasts centuries, which impoverishes the rural poor, sends them into factories. It's not just land. We're right on the Greenwich Meridian. We can see the observatory here. Why was the measurement of time so important? Well, because of power, because of trade, empire, domination. J. Griffiths wrote a fantastic book, Pip Pip, which is a feminist polemic about time. And she calls the Greenwich Observatory a spectacular erection. It's a palace to patriarchy. And notice how the language of empire was encoded in the way that they talked about time. So the main clock in Greenwich was the master clock, and then there were slave clocks elsewhere in London. And she also said that there's a plaque here. I haven't found it yet. It would be interesting to find it. A plaque which commemorates the slave trade in Africans and acknowledges Greenwich's role in that, and says it was to enrich England for centuries and correspondingly destabilise and impoverish Africa. Meantime, indeed. Just a little aside about that last breaking convention, Don Santos, who is the Waradica Huichol Murakami, you've probably seen, he was looking a bit hot and bothered, and I thought I'd be a good hostess. And I'd take him outside and I'd show him the Thames, and I was walking down, this is the Thames, and here's some beautiful buildings. And he was looking increasingly uncomfortable. And I asked Rodrigo, who's his companion and interpreter, I said, well, we know what's going on. And Santos was saying, this is a bad place. There's bad energy here. And we need to do something to mitigate that. And he ended up, and hopefully he'll do something similar this time, but he ended up doing the most simple, the most beautiful ceremony at the end. In the shadow of Canary Wharf, right on the meridian, he dug a hole and he put some flowers and some candles in there, and he blessed it. Rebecca Solnit, she's a writer who I hugely admire, and she's written a lot about uncertainty. She writes of the tyranny of the quantifiable, of the way what can be measured almost always takes precedence over what cannot. And she says, ultimately the destruction of the earth is due in part, perhaps in large part, to a failure of the imagination, or to its eclipse by systems of accounting that can't count what matters. The revolt against this destruction is a revolt of the imagination, in favour of subtleties, of pleasures money can't buy and corporations can't command, of being producers rather than consumers of meaning, of the slow, the meandering, the digressive, the exploratory, the numinous, the uncertain. So how to find our way back to uncertainty? Because we don't want our imaginations to fail, not now. The world needs our imaginations now more than ever. The ancient Greeks had a word for uncertainty, and being in the dark, and they called it aporia. Aporia? I love this term. It's quite new to me. It describes a doubt about what to do or say, but it's far from a negative doubt. It's profoundly generative. As the following quote shows, it says, the true philosophical aporia is always fertile. It breaks with the logic of identity and pertains to the logic of the intermediary. This, to me, speaks to the psychedelic experience. It is a liminal zone where the calcified ego, the logic of identity, breaks down, and we can find something new in an intermediary space where the straight lines of linear time are replaced by something much more interesting. And also, to me, the logic of the intermediary suggests saying I don't know. Because I don't know is a mediating phrase. It builds a bridge, it lets down the drawbridge of our ego defenses. In Plato's Meno, Socrates described the purgative effect of reducing someone to aporia, or not knowing. Now, he may not have been speaking of literal purgatives, but the ayahuasca literally had a purgative effect on me. It purged my overwhelming need for certainty, reduced me to the state of aporia, of I don't know. In Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, aporia plays a role in his method of inquiry. He says, with a view to the science we're seeking, it's necessary we should first review the things about which we need to be puzzled. Wouldn't it be wonderful if today's science, which more than ever seems to be dominated by this aggressively fundamentalist agenda. You've got Rupert Sheldrake's wiki page being desecrated by skeptics on a regular basis. If science started from a place of true agnosticism, of puzzlement, of mystery. I just want to make this clear, when I speak of not knowing, I want to acknowledge that, of course, there is a deeper level of knowing that is available to us. It's beyond our ego's need to shore itself up with knowledge. It's a knowing that's rooted in the body, or at least doesn't separate the body from the mind or the heart, that's untethered. But this sort of knowing cannot be approached head-on. Its true nature is always wrapped up in mystery. Mystery, I just think, such a gorgeous word, made to be whispered in a forest at night. John Keats, one of my favourite poets, he was a man that liked a mystery. On a walk in 1817, he coined the term negative capability, and he says, this is when someone is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after facts or reason. Just lost my way. Bear with me. I think there's medicine in that phrase. I mean, Keats wasn't a tripper, but it seems to me he's speaking to one of the most valuable experiences of plant spirit medicine, which is to invite us to partake of mystery, a mystery which depends on the dark. In Peru, as I lay there with my fear, the shamans came one by one and sang to us. They sang their Icaros, and in the process they helped me release this fear. And it's my understanding, I'm sure many of you are much more expert than I am, but it's my understanding that they depend on darkness to do their work. They depend on the darkness to be able to see, to be able to sing the body back into alignment. And just want to talk a little bit about language and mystery here, because there's a lot of talk this weekend, which is wonderful, but ultimately we're talking about something for which there are no words. We're talking about something which is essentially beyond language. And as Maria has said, language itself is a patriarchal principle. It tends towards an attempt at clarification of utterance, but perhaps what we need is something different, a bit trixier, a little bit more elastic than that. In the Western canon during the last century, there have been various attempts to deconstruct language, to make it more porous and more liminal, more responsive. Lucy Irigaray, she was a French feminist, she said that actually language has to change. If women are going to have their own subjectivity that's recognised as a cultural level, that inclusion of women in the current form just won't work. But I'd go further. I think our ecological, spiritual crisis is also a crisis of language. And we need to acknowledge that language is utterly limited when it comes to extending a subject position to animals, to plants, to all living matter. A strong medicine ceremony, though, taken particularly in nature, I believe can show us that a tree, a river, a stone has its own language, a subject position as real and valuable, if not more so, than our own. I don't mean to suggest that psychedelics are the only way to approach this, of course they're not. But this reciprocity of relationship seems to be taken for granted in cultures with a long psychedelic tradition. I've been privileged enough to come to know a little bit about Waradika culture in the last few years, and they have an intact peyote tradition. It reaches back millennia. And they're animists. They accept that we're in dialogue and dynamic relationship with the natural world. And the peyote, which is taken as a sacrament, allows them to communicate with the deer, with the grandfather fire, with the father sun. And also to learn to listen. To learn to listen to what the fire wants, to what the river wants, to what the mountain wants, and to make offerings as a result. The peyote is the intermediary, but this is no po-faced reverence, and this is really interesting at the level of language. They have a playful element, even when things are at their most sacred, when they go on their pilgrimage to collect the peyote. They change the meaning of nouns. So the sun becomes the sky, the moon becomes the president. This is a trickster spirit at work. It's language that refuses certainty. It refuses to be pinned down. If our own conceptions of language are limited and patriarchal, then this is a language that accepts no hierarchies. In fact, it subverts them in a fertile act of disruption. And this trickster spirit, too, seems to be really important in the defense of the essential mystery of the numinous. The Waradika adopted the Christ figure at the time of Los Cristeros, who were a murderous Catholic sect, And on the surface, it may have appeared that they were buying into the Christian propaganda machine, but far from it. This actually cast a net of protection around them, a smokescreen behind which their traditions continued intact. They knew well the benefits of disguise, since what can't be seen can't be counted, can't even be said to exist. And I think this was how they wanted it for a very long time, but that's changing now. You know, they're reaching out. Similar to other indigenous groups that have kept themselves apart and intact, like the Kogi in Colombia, they're reaching out. They want to speak with us, and I think we need to listen to what they have to say. Just a question that's come up for me, which is that I wonder, wonderful as events like this are, I wonder whether increasingly in the psychedelic community we're in danger of falling prey to a patriarchal urge to taxonomize, to prove, to make certain. How many owls did you have in your DMT trip? How many praying mantises? You know, maybe we can put them through the statistical program and come up with something. And so in so many ways I welcome and celebrate the rate of renaissance in psychedelic research. Of course, it's hugely exciting. But it troubles me a little to think these sacraments are only now gaining traction in the scientific community because they can be seen to exist as medicines, because modern science can measure their effects. But that's a whole other talk. To conclude, this is a call to the importance of that which cannot be measured, that which refuses certainty or absolute meaning, to the trickster, that which says no to the slide rule and up yours to the rulers, for the dark tides of menstruation rather than the clinical exactness of menstruation, for the slippery elliptical, wet, delicious, beating heart of the darkness, a darkness not of the grave, but the generative darkness of the womb.